My son took my car keys right out of my trembling hand, as if I were some child who couldn't be trusted with her own life. He thought that was the end of my freedom. What he didn't see was the way my eyes followed him out the door, calm, quiet, already plotting how I'd take back what was mine. For 30 years, I sacrificed everything for that boy: food, sleep, even my pride. And with one selfish act, he told me my sacrifices meant nothing. The keys weren't just metal and plastic, they were dignity. They were proof that I could still choose where to go, who to see, and when to live my life. He thought I'd sit in silence, waiting for him to return, powerless. But in that silence, I was already moving pieces he didn't even know existed. I smiled to myself, because revenge, when served cold, tastes sweeter than any comfort money can buy. And when I finally put my hands back on those keys, it wasn't just to drive, it was to remind him of one truth: you can't steal freedom from the person who gave you life. What happened next shocked everyone who thought they knew me. Stay with me, because this story will make you question what family really means. Subscribe now, and tell me, what would you have done if your own child stripped you of your independence? I was born and raised in Georgia, where the summers stuck to your skin, and the winters felt like they carried every ghost of the past. My life was never soft, never padded with ease. But when I became a mother, I learned what true sacrifice meant. My husband died young. One rainy night, a car skidded on the highway, and I was left holding a newborn boy in my arms, staring at a future I hadn't chosen. That night, I promised him, my son, that no matter what it took, I would carry both our weights, his father's and mine. I worked mornings at the diner, afternoons cleaning houses, and late nights at the textile mill. My hands smelled of bleach and burnt coffee, my back ached like it carried stones. But when I tiptoed into the crib and saw him sleeping, it felt worth it. He was worth it. Money was always tight. Rent was late more times than I care to admit. Some days, I ate stale bread so he could drink fresh milk. And when school started, I sewed his clothes from second-hand scraps. People whispered about the poor widow under their breath, but I held my head high. My boy would never know shame, not if I could help it. The car, my first real car, wasn't fancy, but it was mine. A faded blue Ford, bought after years of saving crumpled bills in a mason jar I kept hidden behind canned beans. That car carried me to work, to the hospital when my boy was sick, and to church every Sunday. It wasn't just metal, it was proof that even when the world tried to bury me, I found a way out. I remember the look in his eyes when I handed him his first lunchbox for school. He beamed like he owned the world. And I thought, maybe my suffering had a purpose. Every step, every blister, every missed meal, it was building him a life where he could stand taller than I ever did. Through high school, I worked double shifts to pay for his textbooks, his uniforms, his trips. I went without new shoes for 10 years so he could wear the latest sneakers, because I didn't want him to feel less than like I once did. I thought giving him everything would mean he'd never forget what I gave up. When he went to college, I drove him there myself, loaded that Ford with his bags, hugged him on the sidewalk, and cried the whole drive home. I didn't tell him, but I had taken a loan against the car title to cover his tuition gap. I paid it off in silence, month after month, so he could live without knowing the weight of my burden. That car, always that car, it was my silent partner in sacrifice. When the tires wore thin, I patched them. When the engine coughed, I prayed over it and found a way. I knew one day, when I grew old, I might not have much left, but I'd have that car and the freedom it carried. But children grow. And something happened that I didn't see coming. The boy I raised with sweat and sleepless nights began to look at me, not with gratitude, but with a quiet distance. At first, it was small. He'd visit less often, excuse himself with work, with busyness. He'd sigh when I asked him to fix a leaky faucet. His eyes would dart to my hands, trembling a little more with age, and I saw impatience flicker there. I told myself, it was just youth, that he didn't understand yet. That one day he would see the truth behind my sacrifices. I believed if I stayed silent, Love would remind him. But silence, I learned, can become a weapon. The turning point came when he started making choices for me without asking. It began with bills. "Don't worry, Mama, I'll handle that." Yet he never asked how I felt about it. Then, it was about the house. "It's too big for you, we should think about selling," like I didn't own my own walls. And then, the car. He would grip the steering wheel tighter when I drove, point out stop signs I had already seen, mutter about my age, as if it was a sickness. I could feel the judgment in his voice, sharp as broken glass. I had spent my whole life building his road, and now he was looking at me like I was just a rock in his path. What hurt most wasn't the words or the impatience. It was the realization that the boy I raised to stand tall was now using my own sacrifices as proof that I should sit down, stay quiet, and let him take control. I didn't say anything that day. Not yet. I let him believe his narrative. I let him think I was weak, tired, and blind. But in the silence of my kitchen, staring at that mason jar, still sitting there though empty now, I whispered to myself, "You may have grown taller, but you're standing on my shoulders. Don't mistake my silence for surrender." And that's when I knew the day he would try to strip me of my dignity was coming. And when it did, I would be ready. The first time he told me I shouldn't be driving anymore, it felt like a small cut. Not deep enough to bleed, but sharp enough to sting. We were in that same blue Ford, the one I'd sacrificed half my life for. The Georgia sun was dipping low, bleeding red over the highway. My hands were on the wheel, steady enough, though slower than they once were. He sat in the passenger seat, scrolling his phone, sighing louder than the crickets, starting their evening song. "Mama, maybe it's time you let me handle the driving," he said, voice flat, like a doctor delivering bad news. I told him softly that I'd been driving longer than he'd been alive, and my hands still knew the road. But he didn't smile, didn't even look at me. He just muttered, "It's not safe anymore." That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my mind, twisting into something darker. It wasn't just concern. It was judgment. It was control. Over the weeks, his tone hardened. He began calling me forgetful when I misplaced my glasses. He spoke louder, slower, as though age had clogged my ears. Each comment carried the same message. I was no longer capable. Then came the day of the betrayal. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet, humid, with the smell of rain hanging heavy in the air. I had set my purse on the kitchen counter, my car keys glinting on top. I turned to rinse my teacup, and when I turned back, my keys were gone. He stood there, holding them. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold. "You don't need these anymore, Mama," he said. My throat went dry. I asked him what he was doing. He said it was for my own good, that I could take the church shuttle, that neighbors could help me run errands. But his words didn't match his eyes. His eyes weren't worried. They were hungry. I demanded he return them. He shook his head and slipped them into his pocket. "It's time to be realistic. You're not safe behind the wheel." That was the first blow. The second came hours later, when I found a paper on his desk. A listing. My car, online. For sale. That's when I understood. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about love. My son wanted cash, and my independence was the price he was willing to sell. I sat in the dark that night, the house heavy with silence. Every sacrifice I'd made, every meal skipped, every back-breaking shift, every coin I tucked away into that mason jar, flashed before me. And in that silence, I realized to him, I was no longer a mother. I was an obstacle. The humiliation deepened when neighbors started noticing. Mrs. Carter next door asked if I was all right after she saw him driving my car alone. She said he looked proud, like it was his all along. I forced a smile, but inside my chest burned. The worst moment came at church. I had always been the one to offer rides to others, proud of the little freedom I held. That Sunday when someone asked if I could drive them home, my son cut in, laughing lightly, saying, "Mama doesn't drive anymore. It's better this way." The chuckles around me felt like knives. In that pew, under the stained glass glow, I wanted to disappear. I walked home that day, each step echoing louder than the last, until I finally whispered to myself, "They think I'm weak, but they don't know the strength silence can hold." I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I didn't cry in front of him. Instead, I let him believe he had taken something from me, that I was powerless, that the keys, once gone, meant the car was his. But he didn't know the truth. The title of that car was still tucked safely away, sealed in a manila envelope, buried under old photographs in the top drawer of my dresser. My name, my ownership, my dignity, and as I sat on the edge of my bed, the laughter from that church hall still ringing in my ears, I felt something stir inside me, not rage, not grief, resolve, because a mother's silence is not surrender, it's preparation. And when I finally moved, when I finally struck, he would never see it coming. "Blood may tie us," I whispered into the empty room, "but respect is what keeps us family. And you just cut the cord." The night after I discovered my car, listed for sale, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the light from the single lamp spreading across the wood like a halo. The house was still, but my mind was a storm. Every creak of the floorboards felt like the past pressing down on me, whispering of sacrifices made and dignity stolen. I stared at the empty space on the counter, where my keys once rested. That absence cut deeper than any insult my son had thrown. I knew then, if he was willing to take that from me, he would take more. My house, my savings, my very independence. But if he thought I was blind, he was wrong. I began to watch him the way a hunter watches prey, quiet, still, waiting for patterns to reveal themselves. I noticed the late-night phone calls, muffled whispers from the porch, the way he clenched his jaw when unknown numbers flashed across his phone, the letters shoved into his pocket before I could see. Something was chasing him, something bigger than me. One morning, while he showered, I walked past his half-open bedroom door. On his desk lay a stack of envelopes, some unopened, others torn and crumpled. I felt my hands shake as I reached for them. The paper was rough, the ink harsh, overdue notices, final warnings, debt collectors, thousands owed, credit cards maxed. My breath caught in my chest. So this was it. My son wasn't protecting me. He was trying to use me as a lifeline. My car wasn't safety to him. It was currency. I pressed the envelopes back into place before he returned. When he stepped out, humming low and careless, I sat on the couch with a calm face. Inside, my heart was pounding like a drum. The betrayal cut deeper, knowing why. But instead of breaking me, it sharpened me. I began to plan. The first step was knowledge. I needed to know every crack in his story, every shadow he walked in, so I listened. I asked soft questions, pretending to be forgetful, letting him underestimate me. His guard slipped when he thought I was harmless. One night, he mentioned a creditor by name in frustration. I wrote it down, the scratch of my pen, on paper sounding like thunder in the still house. The next morning, I called the number, pretending to be a concerned relative. The voice on the other end confirmed everything. He was drowning in debt, months behind, desperate for cash. The car was just the first pawn in a game he thought he could win. I needed proof, something undeniable. I pulled out my old lockbox, the one tucked behind quilts in my closet. Inside lay documents most had forgotten existed. The original bill of sale for the Ford, the title in my name, insurance slips from years past. My name on every line, my sweat in every mile. I pressed those papers flat against the table, running my fingers over the ink, as though it were scripture. This was my shield, my weapon, my truth. But revenge couldn't just be silent, papers in a drawer. It needed to be calculated, deliberate. So I started small. I began leaving the house at odd hours, claiming errands. In truth, I was meeting with a lawyer in town, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like steel. I told her everything. She listened without judgment, only nodding, before laying out my options. The law was on my side. The car was mine, indisputably. If he tried to sell it, he would face charges. Hearing those words steadied me. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground under my feet again. Still, I didn't move too fast. I let him believe he was winning. I let him parade around, driving my car as if it were already his. Each time I smiled, silent, because the deeper he sank, the stronger my case would be. At night, I wrote everything down in a small notebook: dates, times, what he said, what he did. A ledger of betrayal, each entry a reminder that I wasn't imagining this, that I wasn't crazy, that he was crossing lines too sharp to ignore. One evening, I overheard him on the phone, his voice low, tense. "I'll get the money. Don't worry. I've got something lined up." Something lined up. My stomach twisted. I stepped back into the shadows before he saw me. My heart beat hard, but my face stayed calm. That night, I pulled the title from the lockbox and slid it into the pages of my Bible, the one that had carried me through grief, poverty, and storms. If he thought he could erase me from my own life, he would have to fight the very foundation I stood on. I prayed softly, not for him, not anymore. I prayed for strength, for clarity, for patience to carry out what I now knew I must do. Because revenge is not rage. Revenge is preparation. And I was preparing well. Still, doubt whispered. Could I truly go against my own flesh and blood? Could I expose my son's lies, knowing it would ruin him? I thought of all the nights I went hungry, of the shoes I wore until holes bled through the soles, of the car I bought coin by coin. And then I remembered the look in his eyes when he pocketed my keys, not worried, not caring, but greedy. That memory silenced the doubt. I rose from my chair, smoothed the papers before me, and whispered into the night, "You took the keys, but the title was always mine, and soon the world will see it." The morning he swaggered out the door with my keys jingling in his pocket, I watched from the window. The car engine started, coughed once, then steadied into a hum. My blue Ford rolled down the street, my son gripping the wheel as if he owned the world. He believed victory was his. But what he didn't know was that I had already taken the first step in dismantling his illusion. I waited until his taillights disappeared before I moved. My Bible lay open on the table, the title hidden inside, its edges crisp and undeniable. I slid it out, smoothed the page, and stared at the black letters that spelled my name. Proof, power, independence. That morning I returned to the lawyer in town. Her office smelled of old books and ink, the air humming with quiet authority. I placed the title on her desk, my hands steady now. "This car is mine," I told her. Her eyes scanned the paper, then met mine. "Yes, and no one can take it without your consent. If he's tried to list it, that's fraud." Her words were steel. They carved away the last of my fear. We filed the papers that same day, securing every legal right in my name, quietly, efficiently. My son thought he held the keys, but in truth, he held nothing. Still, I didn't rush to reveal my hand. Revenge requires patience. I let him strut around, driving to his friends, pretending the Ford was his. Each mile he drove dug his grave deeper, because every witness saw him in a car that wasn't his to sell. In the evenings, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote in my ledger, April 14th. Took car without permission, April 15th. Spoke on phone about getting money. Each line was a nail in the coffin of his lies. The first real strike came with the bank. I had kept our finances separate for years, but a few lingering ties remained, an account where I had once added his name for emergencies. I realized now that leaving him there was the real danger. Quietly, I went to the bank, signed the forms, and stripped his access. By the time he tried to withdraw, it was gone. He stormed into the kitchen that night, face red, voice sharp. "Mama, did you change the account?" I looked at him evenly. I protected what was mine. His jaw worked, but he said nothing. He couldn't. He knew deep down he was cornered, but that was only the beginning. I learned from the lawyer that if he attempted to finalize the sale of the car, I could press charges. So I waited. And sure enough, 1 week later, he marched into the house, trying to sound casual. "Someone's coming tomorrow to look at the car," he said, flipping through his phone. I felt a calmness wash over me. Tomorrow. That was the day everything would shift. The next morning, I rose early. The air was cool, dew still clinging to the grass. I pulled the title from the Bible, tucked it into my purse, and drove into town, with a neighbor who offered me a ride. We went straight to the courthouse. By noon, I had filed a claim of attempted fraud and secured a legal notice forbidding any transfer of ownership without my presence. The law was now on paper, stamped and sealed. When I returned home, the buyer was already in the driveway, a man in a baseball cap, glancing over the Ford with approving eyes. My son stood beside him, puffed up with pride. "This beauty's in great shape," the buyer said. I stepped forward, my purse in hand, my voice clear. "It should be. Eve kept it that way for 30 years. The man frowned, looking between us. My son stiffened. "She doesn't drive anymore," he said quickly. "I'm handling this for her." I pulled the title from my purse, unfolded it slowly, and held it out. "No, you're not." The buyer's eyes scanned the page. His expression hardened. "Your name's the only one here." My son's face drained of color. He stammered, reaching for words, but the buyer was already stepping back. "I'm not getting involved in this mess." He left without another glance. Silence fell over the driveway. My son turned to me, his fists clenched, but my voice cut sharper than any blow. "You can take my keys, but you can't take what I've built. This car is mine. Always was, always will be." He shouted then, words filled with venom, calling me stubborn, ungrateful, accusing me of ruining his life. I didn't answer. The silence said everything. That night, I made my next move. I remembered another asset, small but vital. Years ago, I had co-signed his first credit card when he begged for help. Foolishly, I thought it would teach him responsibility. Instead, it fed his hunger. Quietly, I called the company, withdrew my name, and left the debt squarely on his shoulders. The next day, the calls began. Collectors chasing him, not me. He paced the kitchen, cursing under his breath, while I sipped my tea in silence. By the end of that week, I had frozen every loose end he might exploit. Accounts locked, assets protected, every door to my life barred against him. He stood outside, rattling the doorknobs of control, and found only steel. But I wasn't finished. The final strike had to be public. It had to be unforgettable. So I waited for the right moment. It came on a Sunday, the one place where gossip ran faster than wildfire: church. That morning, I drove myself for the first time in weeks. The Ford purred under my hands, loyal as always. Heads turned as I pulled into the lot. Whispers rose as I stepped out, my son trailing behind me, his face pale. During service, I sat tall, and when the pastor opened the floor for testimonies, I stood. My son's eyes widened, but it was too late. I told the congregation the truth. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with calm clarity. I spoke of sacrifice, of trust, of betrayal. I told them about the car, the keys, the debt. And then, with the title in my hand, I declared, "You can strip a person of many things, but you cannot take dignity when it belongs to God and to yourself." The room was silent. Then murmurs, then nods. My son shifted uncomfortably, the weight of every eye upon him. That was the moment the power shifted forever, because revenge isn't fire, it's light. And when I shined that light, his shadows had nowhere left to hide. I returned home that day, the title locked safely away again, the Ford resting in the driveway where it belonged. My son avoided my gaze, his pride shattered, his lies exposed. And though I said nothing more, my silence carried a truth he could never escape. "You thought you took my freedom, but I never gave you permission." The Sunday service should have ended quietly, with handshakes and hymns fading into soft chatter. But for me, it was only the beginning. That morning, I had not only driven myself for the first time in weeks, I had driven into the heart of his pride. As I stood there in the church, my voice calm but steady, holding the title for all to see. I could feel the air change. The sanctuary that had always been filled with whispers of prayers now hummed with whispers of judgment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Each word I spoke was a hammer, striking the hollow wood of his lies. For 30 years, I carried this family on my back, I said, my gaze steady on the congregation. I ate less so my son could eat more. I worked double shifts so he could have a future. And when I bought this car, it wasn't just metal on wheels. It was my freedom, my dignity, my proof that even when the world tried to bury me, I could still stand. Eyes turned to my son. He sat rigid in the pew, his face drained of color, sweat forming at his temples. But when he took my keys, I continued. It wasn't love, it wasn't protection, it was greed. He wanted to sell what wasn't his. He wanted to profit off the very sacrifice that raised him. Gasps rippled through the pews. Mrs. Carter clasped her hand to her mouth. Brother Thomas shook his head slowly. My son finally rose, his voice sharp. That's not true. She's twisting everything. The congregation turned to him, waiting. He stammered, hands trembling, trying to force out excuses. I was just looking out for her. She's too old to drive. It was dangerous. I let his words hang in the air, heavy and hollow. Then, without a word, I unfolded the title and held it high. The paper gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the stained glass. My name, I said softly, only mine. The silence that followed was deafening. The pastor, a man who had baptized my son as a child, stepped forward slowly. His voice was low but firm. Son, respect is the foundation of family. Without it, everything crumbles. My son's shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around the room, searching for someone, anyone to side with him. But there was no one. The truth had stripped him bare. Whispers grew louder, circling like vultures. Words floated, shameful, ungrateful. Poor woman. He bolted then, storming down the aisle, his footsteps echoing like gunshots. The doors slammed behind him, rattling the walls, but it didn't end there. The story spread like fire. By the next morning, the whole town knew. At the grocery store, people glanced at me with pity, with respect. At the diner they shook their heads, muttering about that boy, and what he did. For the first time, the humiliation wasn't mine to carry. It was his. He came home that evening, slamming the door so hard, the windows rattled. His face was red, his voice hoarse from anger. How could you do that to me in front of everyone? He shouted. I met his rage with silence, my eyes calm. Finally I spoke. I didn't do anything to you. You did it to yourself. He cursed, pacing, his words sharp and bitter. He threw his hands in the air, blaming me for his debts, for his struggles, for every failure in his life. I listened, unmoved, because I knew the truth. His downfall wasn't my doing. It was the consequence of choices he made, long before he touched my keys. Finally, he stopped, chest heaving, eyes blazing. You've ruined me, he hissed. I stood slowly, walked to the dresser, and pulled out the manila envelope, where the original papers had lived for years. I held them to my chest, my voice steady. No, you ruined yourself. All I did was stop covering your tracks. His fists clenched, but I didn't flinch. For the first time, I saw him not as my son, but as a man stripped of excuses. And for the first time, he saw me not as a frail woman, but as the mother who had built her strength in silence. He stormed out that night, slamming the door behind him, his shadow stretching across the porch light. The days that followed carved the truth deeper into the town's memory. People began to avoid him, whispers trailing wherever he went. Creditors came knocking louder, bolder, now that his shame was public. One afternoon, I watched from the porch as he argued with a debt collector in the yard. His voice cracked, his hands shook. The collector's car drove away, leaving him standing there, broken. I didn't speak. I didn't comfort him. Some lessons are only learned when the silence grows heavy enough to crush. The climax came a week later, at another community gathering, a festival, bright with music and laughter. I hadn't planned to attend, but my neighbors insisted. I drove myself there, the Ford gleaming in the sun. Heads turned as I pulled up, whispers following, respect in their eyes now. My son was already there, trying to mingle, trying to wear a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But when I stepped out of that car, the crowd's attention shifted. People approached me, not him. They asked about my well-being, my strength, my story. He stood off to the side, invisible in the very place he once thought he shone. And then, as though fate demanded one last blow, a man approached him, a creditor, papers in hand. Voices rose, sharp, undeniable. The crowd noticed. Whispers spread. He tried to argue, tried to deny. But the papers told the truth. Debts unpaid, promises broken, lies exposed. The festival air grew heavy with judgment. My son's face flushed crimson, his words faltering. And in that moment, under the bright Georgia sun, surrounded by neighbors and friends, his pride crumbled. The humiliation was complete, public, and forgettable. I didn't smile. I simply stood, silent, watching as the weight of his choices pressed him to the ground. Because revenge, true revenge, isn't about shouting louder. It's about standing taller in silence, while the truth speaks for itself. And the truth was louder than any words I could ever say. That night, as I drove home, the Ford humming steady beneath me, I whispered into the quiet air. The days after his public humiliation were quieter than I expected. The phone stopped ringing with his excuses. The slamming of doors, the stomping of footsteps, the angry mutters, those faded like a storm that had finally exhausted itself. For the first time in weeks, the house breathed again. I woke one morning to the sound of birds outside the window, soft and steady. The sun stretched across the curtains, painting the room gold. For years I had woken to stress, to sacrifice, to the endless pull of what others needed. That morning, I woke to silence, and it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was peace. I went to the porch with a cup of tea, the steam curling up into the Georgia air. The Ford sat in the driveway, the blue paint dulled by years, but still proud. I ran my hand along its hood, the metal warm under the morning sun. For the first time in a long time, I saw it not as something he tried to take, but as something I had kept, mine, a symbol of endurance. That day I drove. Not to town, not for errands, just to drive. The windows rolled down, the wind catching the strands of my hair. The trees arched overhead, their leaves whispering as I passed. The road wound through familiar places, fields I had once walked to work through, houses I had once cleaned to pay bills, the school where I had waited in line to pick up my boy. Each mile was a memory, but instead of pain, they carried pride. Because I survived all of it, and I was still here. As the car hummed beneath me, I thought about family, blood ties, the way people assume love is automatic, guaranteed. But I had learned that day in the church, under the stained glass, that love without respect is nothing but chains. When I pulled over at the lake, I sat on the hood and watched the water ripple. I remembered the nights I cried, here, wondering how I would afford rent, how I would feed him. I remembered whispering prayers into the dark, and I remembered the promise I had made to myself, that I would never let anyone strip me of dignity, not even the son I gave life to. Neighbors stopped by more often after that. Some came with pies, others with kind words. They looked at me with something new in their eyes, respect. I was no longer just the widow who worked herself to the bone. I was the woman who stood her ground when her own blood turned greedy. And him, he drifted. Some nights I heard his car pull up late, his footsteps heavy. Other nights, he didn't come at all. Debt collectors circled closer. Friends stopped answering his calls. The same community that once praised his charm now looked at him with disappointment. He tried once weeks later to ask for forgiveness. He stood on the porch, his eyes red, his voice low. "Mama, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just needed help." I looked at him, really looked at him. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, clutching my hand on the first day of school, eyes wide with fear. But then I remembered the man who had snatched my keys, who had lied, who had tried to sell the very thing that symbolized my independence. I shook my head slowly. Help isn't demanded, it's asked for with respect. He dropped his gaze. I didn't slam the door on him. I didn't shout. I simply stepped back inside, leaving the screen door between us. Some distances can't be closed, not even by blood. In the weeks that followed, I built a new rhythm. I went to church on Sundays, driving myself again, the congregation greeting me with nods of admiration. I joined a Bible study, something I had always put off. I even visited an old friend across town, laughing over memories I had forgotten, I still carried. The house felt lighter, not because he was gone, but because the weight of his shadow no longer ruled it. One evening, I opened the lockbox again. Inside were the documents that had saved me, the bill of sale, the title, the insurance slips. I didn't need to clutch them anymore. They weren't just protection, they were history. Proof that I had built something on my own. Proof that no one could erase. I tucked them back into the Bible. But this time with a different feeling, not fear, not desperation, and gratitude. Because they had reminded me who I was when I almost forgot. I sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, pen in hand. I flipped back through the ledger of betrayal, nates, times, details of his lies. For a moment, I thought about burning it, about erasing the pain. But then I closed it gently and slid it back into the drawer, not as a wound, but as a record, a lesson. Because forgetting would mean it could happen again. Remembering meant I was stronger. Life grew simple again, quiet. I tended to my garden, hands in the soil, the smell of earth grounding me. I cooked meals for myself, not rushed, not skipped, and in the evenings I drove the back roads, windows down, humming along to old gospel songs on the radio. One night, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange, I whispered to myself, my freedom was never parked in his garage. It's been in my hands all along. The peace that settled over me then was different from anything I had known. It wasn't the tired peace of survival, the kind that comes after scraping through another storm. It was the proud peace of standing tall after the storm has passed. He may never understand what he did. He may never say sorry, but I no longer needed his apology to heal. I had already taken back what was mine. My dignity, my independence, my voice. And in that victory, I found a new kind of freedom, the freedom of knowing I could never be silenced again. Real family doesn't strip you of freedom. Real family gives you wings. My son thought he could take my keys and my dignity, but he learned a lesson the hard way. Respect is worth more than money, and dignity cannot be sold. If you've ever given everything, only to be treated as if you were nothing, remember this truth. You don't need their permission to stand tall. I told my story because somewhere out there, another mother, another father, another grandparent is silently carrying the same pain. If this touched your heart, share it. Leave your story in the comments. And don't forget, subscribe, because real stories like this deserve to be heard.